Hollywood cast Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra in 1963. The DNA says she never looked like that, not even close. Genetic analysis from recovered bone samples confirms Cleopatra VII carried 0 Mediterranean ancestry. 0 Greek. 0 Roman. 100% Nubian Egyptian. Born from the same bloodline as the Nile's oldest kingdoms. But Hollywood buried that truth for 7 decades and replaced a black African queen with a white woman draped in gold eyeshadow and false lashes, and called it history. They didn't just miscast a role. They erased an entire civilization's identity and sold the erasure to 1 billion people who had no reason to question it. This is the story they didn't want you to know. And once you hear it, you will never look at a history book the same way again. To understand who Cleopatra really was, you have to go back further than most people dare to look. Not to Rome. Not to Greece. Not to the glossy pages of a Hollywood screenplay. You have to go back to the Nile Valley itself, to a civilization so ancient, so mathematically precise, so spiritually advanced, that when Alexander the Great first laid eyes on it in 332 BC, even he fell silent in the presence of its temples and bowed his head before its priests. Egypt at that moment was already 3,000 years old. Its pyramids at Giza had stood for 2 millennia before a single Greek philosopher was ever born. Its libraries held astronomical records that European scholars wouldn't match until the Renaissance. The Nile Valley was not a peripheral culture. It was the center of the known world's intellectual and economic gravity for the longest continuous stretch of organized civilization in human history. Cleopatra VII Philippeta was born in 69 BC in Alexandria, Egypt, the cosmopolitan capital her ancestors had ruled since the death of Alexander. She was the daughter of Ptolemy XII Olates, and she would ascend to co-rule Egypt at age 18 alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. The Ptolemaic Dynasty had held power in Egypt since 305 BC, when Ptolemy I, a Macedonian general under Alexander, seized control of the kingdom following Alexander's death. For generations, Western historians have leaned hard into this Macedonian lineage to classify Cleopatra as Greek. They point to the dynasty's origin and declare the case closed. But history, like DNA, does not lie when you look at the complete sequence. Here is what those same historians quietly omit. The Ptolemaic royal family intermarried with Egyptian and Nubian nobility across multiple generations. They worshipped Egyptian gods. Cleopatra herself was the first ruler in 300 years of Ptolemaic reign to actually speak the Egyptian language fluently, along with 8 other languages including Ethiopian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Parthian. She was initiated into the mysteries of Isis and bore the title Daughter of Are, the same sacred designation carried by the Black Pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, the Nubian pharaohs of Kush who ruled Egypt from 747 BC to 656 BC. These were her spiritual and biological predecessors. The lineage was not metaphorical. It was chromosomal. The turning point in Cleopatra's story and in how we understand her ancestry begins with the bones. In 2009, Austrian archaeologist Hilke Thursday of the Austrian Academy of Sciences re-examined skeletal remains discovered in a tomb in Ephesus, Turkey, a site known as the Heron. The remains belong to a young woman estimated to have died between the ages of 15 and 18. This woman was Arsinoe IV, Cleopatra's younger sister. The 2 siblings shared the same mother. And here is where the story shifts irrevocably. Forensic analysis of Arsinoe's skull and bone structure identified characteristics consistent with Sub-Saharan African morphology. Her cranial measurements, bone density ratios, and facial reconstruction pointed not toward Mediterranean Europe but toward East and Central Africa. Not partially. Predominantly. The science was peer-reviewed. The findings were published. And then, almost immediately, they were buried beneath a flood of academic skepticism, institutional resistance, and the quiet machinery of a Western scholarly establishment that had too much invested in the Greek Cleopatra to allow the African one to stand unchallenged. But the evidence did not disappear. Because Arsinoe IV and Cleopatra VII shared a mother. That maternal line is the critical thread. While Cleopatra's father Ptolemy XII is documented, her mother's identity has never been definitively confirmed in ancient sources, an absence that is itself suspicious given how thoroughly Egyptian royal genealogy was recorded. What we do know is that Ptolemy XII fathered children with at least one woman who was not Greek, not Macedonian, and not Roman. The genetic signature in Arsinoe's remains tells you exactly who that woman was. She was African. Indigenous African. And she gave both her daughters the bones that the forensic record confirms. Now layer in the economic and military reality of who Cleopatra ruled and what she commanded, because this is how you measure the true weight of a civilization. In 51 BC, when Cleopatra assumed the throne at age 18, Egypt was generating an estimated 7,000 talents of silver in annual revenue, roughly equivalent to $20 billion in today's purchasing power. The grain output of the Nile Delta alone fed a significant portion of the Mediterranean world. Egypt exported papyrus, linen, glass, and spices at volumes that gave it leverage over every trading partner from Rome to India. Julius Caesar, the most powerful military commander in the Western world, came to Egypt in 48 BC not because he was on a romantic adventure but because he needed access to Egyptian grain reserves to sustain his legions. Rome at the time had an army of approximately 300,000 soldiers requiring continuous supply chains. Egypt was the engine of that supply chain. Cleopatra understood this. She leveraged it with surgical precision. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra was 21 years old and had been temporarily exiled by her brother's advisors. She had herself smuggled into the palace road inside a linen sack to gain an audience with Caesar, not out of desperation but out of strategic confidence. She knew that whoever controlled Egypt controlled Rome's food supply. Caesar aligned with her immediately. Within a year, he had eliminated her brother, restored her to sole rule, and fathered her first child, Caesarion. This was not seduction. This was geopolitics conducted at the highest level by a woman who spoke 9 languages, commanded an army of 60,000 trained soldiers, controlled a navy of 200 warships, and managed a national treasury that outweighed Rome's by a factor of 3. When Caesar was assassinated on March 15, 44 BC, Cleopatra moved without hesitation. She returned to Egypt, consolidated power, and within 3 years had formed an alliance with Mark Antony, Caesar's most powerful successor. Together they commanded a combined military force that ancient sources place at approximately 120,000 soldiers and 500 ships at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, the largest naval engagement the ancient Mediterranean had witnessed in a generation. They faced Octavian, Rome's rising power, with a force of roughly 400 ships and 80,000 ground troops. The battle was close until betrayal from within their ranks turned the tide. Even in defeat, Cleopatra's command of resources